welcome to Writer of the Week. Today we're here with Elizabeth Ann Wood, author of Bound, A Daughter, a Domme, and an End-of-Life Story. She's a SUNY Chancellor's Award-winning professor of sociology at Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York, and senior strategist for Woodhull Freedom Foundation, the nation's only human rights organization working full-time to protect sexual freedom as a fundamental human right. Bound, A Daughter, a Domme, and an End-of-Life Story is her first book and is published by She Writes Press. Welcome, Elizabeth. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So we'll start off with you reading an excerpt from your book. Can you set the scene for us?
Sure. So I live in New York. My mother lives in Philadelphia, and the book opens with me arriving in Philadelphia at the hospital where she was admitted the night before through the emergency room, or the day before through the emergency room. And she had this night of delirium right before that, which was before a doctor's appointment that was regularly scheduled. So she showed up to her doctor's appointment looking a mess. They admit her to the hospital, and I get a phone call in New York. So chapter 1 is about my arriving at the hospital, learning that something is spiking her blood sugar that's causing the delirium, and that she has metastatic cancer, but we don't know what kind yet. Then my aunt takes me back to my mother's apartment where we clean up the mess that she had made the night before her admission. And my aunt introduces me to this large St. Andrew's cross in Mom's craft room. That's a big piece of bondage equipment. And I spend the rest of the chapter, the rest of that night, thinking about our relationship and thinking about her recent sexual explorations and what this new illness is likely to mean for that. So the scene I'm going to read is from the beginning of chapter 2, and it just gives you a quick picture of Mom and me. The chapter is called Role Reversals. So at this hour in New York, I'd be getting ready to walk into my first class of the day, Introduction to Sociology. Instead, I'm approaching a hospital complex where I feel more like a student and less like an instructor. Despite the reversal of roles and the seriousness of what goes on inside, this hospital has a familiar feel that puts me oddly at ease. It's a large university hospital full of students and faculty. It's also a place where Mom and I have spent plenty of time together. This is the hospital to which the ambulance rushed her during my Christmas visit in 2000, when she woke up unable to breathe and was diagnosed with congestive heart failure and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. This is the hospital to which we came 3 years ago, when a routine OB/GYN visit led to the exploration of some serious bloating she was having, which led to the discovery of a large malignant tumor on one of her kidneys. It was here that the cancerous kidney was removed, and here that we returned at the end of that summer when her remaining kidney failed. In the buildings attached to this hospital are all the doctors who've cared for her as she's dealt with diabetes, heart and lung ailments, cancer, and dialysis, and who will now help her through whatever this new frightening crisis is. I have confidence in this hospital. No matter what she's facing, I feel she's safe here. We're safe here. I find my mother in her brightly lit room on the first floor with large windows that look out onto a courtyard of sorts. It's crowded with machines, but at least the second bed is empty. "Hi, how are you feeling this morning?" I bend to kiss Mom and try to hug her, but it's awkward with the wires and tubes running from her chest and arms to the monitors and IV poles that surround her. She seems cautiously pleased to see me and looks up at me with a strange blend of suspicion and mischief in her watery blue eyes. I'm guessing she's still a bit delirious. "They say I have sparkles in my brain," she tells me again. "The sparkles are in your skull, not in your brain," I remind her. "But my brain is in my skull." She sounds childlike, and I smile and acknowledge the truthfulness of her statement. Her petite 5-foot frame looks even smaller tucked into the hospital bed. Her short, dyed auburn hair hasn't been touched up in a while, and it doesn't look like she had the presence of mind to brush it before making her way, delusional, to the doctor's office Monday morning. Her eyes are heavy-lidded but alert. She looks adorably rumpled, but frighteningly weak. More like a sick child than a successful dominatrix. It's hard to believe that the owner of that enormous wooden cross, a woman who has no doubt strung men up, cuffed them to those eye bolts, blindfolded them with those shiny scarves, and administered painful blows with her assortment of canes, whips, and floggers, is the same small figure I see before me, bound by wires and tubes to a bed she is too delusional and weak to escape.
So why did you decide to write Bound, and when did the writing process start?
Well, my mother was a writer. She was a journalist by training, but most of her work was in administrative work. Still, she really loved to write. And when she was sick, we talked together about what it would be like to write a book about our unconventional relationship and her sexual exploration and her illness. But ultimately, she was really too sick to do any writing. And I don't think that I would have been able to write in an emotionally honest way without being really afraid of hurting her feelings. So that was not possible. But still, I took a lot of notes while she was sick, and I was very open about the fact that I was going to write this story, and she wanted it written. And after she died, which was in 2012, it took about a year before I was ready to write. But once I started writing, the first draft went pretty quickly. The revision process took a lot longer, of course.
And you seem to have a special affinity with approaching difficult conversations. Do you feel your openness influenced your mother, or is it a result of her influence over you?
Well, my mom and I had a really codependent relationship while I was growing up. She was an alcoholic, and she got sober when I was 8. But like a lot of children of alcoholics, especially first children, oldest children, I took on a caregiving role. And my mother shared a lot of things with me that parents don't always share with their children. And so I knew a lot more about her worries and her concerns than kids often know about their parents. But the plus side is that she was really open about all kinds of things. She was open about sexuality and about bodies. My sister and I were always able to ask her questions when we were growing up. And when I was 17 and I wanted to have sex with my boyfriend for the first time, I didn't have to worry about asking her to take me to Planned Parenthood. We had an easy conversation about that. At the same time, I did a lot of therapy work in my 20s to establish better boundaries with her. And that also caused me to have to practice some difficult conversations. But I think that the conversations about sexuality that she and I had, whether it was mine or hers, were some of the easiest conversations. Conversations later at the end of her life about her illness, those were a lot harder.
What was her reaction to you when you first started setting boundaries? It must have been a shock to her in some way.
It was a big shock. She was not at all happy, and I think I experienced a bit of pendulum swing. So I went from being very open with her and really she and I sharing everything together to closing her out of a lot of things, and that was really hard. So it took some time into my 30s, I think, before the pendulum kind of settled in a happy medium where I could share enough with her but not overshare. And even when it came to her sexuality later on, when she was in her late 50s and 60s, I was able to say, I'm happy to know all about what you're exploring. I'm happy to be a resource for you. But when she would start to read me an email, for instance, that a man had sent her, I didn't really want to know those details, and I was able to say that.
So, how did the fact that you knew so much about your mother's sexuality affect your relationship with her when you were her caregiver?
That's a great question. It helped in two really big ways, I think. First of all, it turned out that one of her lovers, a person I call Kenny in the book, who was this incredibly special man in her life at the end of her life, he took part in her care with me. So I was able to depend on him partly because she had been able to be open about their relationship. And if you read the book, you'll see there are some kind of funny and kind of uncomfortable scenes about the way that Kenny relates to her in contrast to the way that my sister and I relate to her. But the other thing that it did that I think is something a lot of kids don't necessarily get is that it meant that my sister and I had nothing uncomfortable to discover about her once she was sick or after she died. And I've heard horror stories from friends who have discovered something about their parents, a secret or a lie that had been told, that they only discover after their parent is gone and that they can't process. And it really fundamentally changes the way they saw their parent. And I didn't have to worry about that. There were no surprises, no secrets. And even though my sister and I had different attitudes toward our mother's sexuality to some degree, we both got that benefit. So I'm really grateful for that.
And you tell a story in the book about a doctor suggesting that you try to quote unquote be the daughter.
Oh,
Can you tell
yes.
us a bit about that story, how that felt and why it matters for family caregivers?
Yeah, that was one of the most difficult things that I had to deal with. What happened was I had been in her hospital room during the day. She was really in a in kind of a health crisis. She was delirious. The doctors thought that she had a systemic infection and maybe sepsis, and we were very worried that she might not make it. And I stayed the night in her room just in case she deteriorated further. But in that evening, she, in her delirium, turned on me and she started accusing me of being on the doctor's side instead of hers, really about conspiring against her. And I was heartbroken by that. And I went out into the hall and I had a conversation with a nurse who helped me put it in perspective. And I called a friend who helped me put it in perspective and told me it was okay to go back in and just sit quietly, which is what I did. And I stayed the night. She settled down. And the next day, I was in the family waiting room and making some phone updates when the doctor who was taking care of her then, the oncologist who was the hospital oncologist, came in with the chaplain and the social worker for the unit to talk to me about what did we want to do in the case that her condition deteriorated further. Did we want to send her to the ICU, or did we want to manage her care as best we could on the floor, and then let nature take its course? And so before we had that conversation, I told them what had happened the night before. And the hospitalist, the oncologist, said to me, you know, Elizabeth, sometimes you just need to be the daughter. And I felt like I'd been kicked in the stomach, because I thought, well, what have I been doing all this time? And this is what daughters do. They're caregivers, and they organize all this information, and they keep notes, and they keep track, and they keep their mother safe. And what she really meant was sometimes what the mother needs is just for the daughter to be a person who comforts and who can show affection. And so she suggested that I put my notebook aside and just be that kind of affectionate daughter. And that was terrifying, because I knew that I was using my note-taking and my record-keeping in a way to keep mom's illness at a kind of emotional distance. And so it was very scary to put my notebook aside, but I'm really glad that I did. And I'm still very, very grateful for that doctor's advice.
So, did your training as a sociologist help you in dealing with the role conflict of being both her daughter and her caregiver, or were you too close to the situation for that to help?
No, I think it did help. In fact, it's funny you use the word role conflict, because in the in the family waiting room that day when we were having that hard conversation, I explained role conflict and role strain to these women, these lovely women who were helping to care for my mother. And I realized in doing that I really did use my sociology training partly to make the situation just feel manageable. So in that sense, I think that my sociology training was helpful. It also helped me feel like I understood why the difficult things were happening. So role conflict is what happens when you have two different sets of expectations from two different roles that you're playing, and they're not consistent with one another. So how to be the daughter while also being the caregiver or the record keeper, that's role conflict. And at least it caused me to know that I wasn't losing my mind. It caused me to know that I wasn't a failure at this, that this was something that everybody would experience, anybody would experience in this situation. So that helped too. It helped me put it in context.
And healthcare providers are apparently reluctant to discuss death or sexuality. Why do you think that is? And do you have any advice for today's caregivers or things future caregivers can do to make sure those issues aren't pushed under the rug?
Yeah, sure. You know, it's fascinating, I think, that sex and death, which are two really universal parts of human life, are so difficult to talk about. And when I look at US culture anyway, sex and death are pervasive. And all you have to do is look at something like Game of Thrones to see both of them intertwined all the time. But the sex and death that we see in all of our mass media isn't the kind that represents most people's experiences. So I don't think we're very well prepared for talking about either of those things, just as an entire society. Doctors specifically, at least in the US, get very little training in sexuality and almost none in how to talk about sex with their patients. And in addition, I think they see death as failure instead of as a natural part of life. Their training is to focus on healing, not on creating the best death possible for a person. So for all those reasons, it's very hard to have these conversations. So there are a couple things I think that people can do. One of the things caregivers can do is read as much as they can about death. For instance, there are some great books out recently. Sally Tisdale's book, Advice for Future Corpses, or Hayder Werich's book, Modern Death. We can read and we can educate ourselves about these things so we know what kinds of questions we should be asking. And asking questions is incredibly important because a standard conversation in a hospital room about a do not resuscitate order, for instance, might sound like a doctor saying, well, so do you want CPR? Do you want antibiotics? Do you want IV fluids? And unless you can stop that conversation for a moment and ask, well, what would it look like if I didn't do those things? Or what are the typical outcomes for people who do those things? Then you're answering the questions based on not enough information. And the same thing is true in the other direction often regarding sex. A doctor is really unlikely to ask you, especially if you're a woman over 40, about your sex life and about how it's being affected by your condition. So you have to be willing to bring up the question to educate your doctor about what you want or need. And about a year ago, I was at a workshop at Woodhull's Sexual Freedom Summit, and I listened to a woman named Joan Price, who's written some great books about sex and aging, tell us, memorize this phrase. And I wish I had memorized it entirely. I don't remember it word for word, but basically it went like this. This is something you can memorize to say to your doctor. My sexuality is important to me. I need you to be able to talk to me about sexuality and how it might be affected by my health and by my condition or my treatment. Are you able to do that? And of course, then if a doctor says, no, they're not able to do that, then you have to be able to find another doctor. Not always an easy thing to do. But you have to raise the question because they won't do it for you.
And you mentioned doing research, but I've heard some stories about doctors getting very hot under the collar when they hear that you Googled something. Their reaction being, well, I have a $150,000 degree and you Googled it.
Right.
How do you think people should phrase that so that they don't offend the doctor or shut down communication even further?
That's a fair question. I think the doctor's kind of indignation in those moments is sometimes justified because I think patients sometimes think, well, here, I know as much as you do now. Instead, I think the better way to frame the question is to come in and say, here's what I know, and here's what I need to know. What can you tell me that's going to help me understand this? Quite frequently, potential patients or advocates have read stuff on the internet that they don't even fully understand. So that's another opening. Here's what I've read. I'm not sure I understand it. Can you explain it to me? That communicates to the doctor that you understand the doctor is an expert, but that you're also doing your best to inform yourself, which I think doctors do appreciate, generally speaking.
I think that's very wise advice. In addition to being an author, you were a life coach. How did your mother's attitude towards life influence you both in your decision to become a coach and in your coaching style?
Well, that's a really interesting question because I think one thing I never was for my mother was a very good coach. As a child of an alcoholic, one of the things like I said earlier, that I grew up doing was fixing problems for her, or trying to anyway. So I think with my mother, I was always in a kind of rescue mode, and whenever possible, I did things for her instead of being a good coach, which would be a person who would help her learn how to do them herself. But as a child of an alcoholic and a person in a codependent relationship, I did a lot of fixing of things. Still, I think part of my growing up with her shaped my desire to be in helping profession kinds of roles. So my role as a teacher and my role as a coach. But as a coach, what I'm about is helping you do things for yourself, right? Not doing them for you. So I've coached friends through dissertations. I've coached colleagues through the tenure process, and I've been working as a coach with the president and CEO of Woodhull Freedom Foundation for a lot of years. I think in all that time, one thing I've learned is that the key to good coaching is to really listen well and help people articulate their goals instead of telling them what you think their goals should be. Like, that's not good coaching. And then to think strategically about the best way to reach those goals and to be there to kind of encourage and cheer them on as they are the ones doing the hard work of all of that. So the style I've developed is really a blend of a kind of pragmatic optimism mixed with a lot of compassion and empathy. So I will be the one to help you figure out the most rational, efficient way of achieving the goals you've set for yourself. But I'll also be there to really listen non-judgmentally as you discuss all the hurdles that you're facing along the way.
And you said that the purpose of your book is to open spaces for conversations between parents and their adult children, between caregivers and those who need them, and between healthcare providers and patients, and that the quality of our lives depend on them. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. This is so important to me. This is maybe the most important reason that I wrote this book. So as we were talking about a few minutes ago, some of the most important things that are parts of our lives, things like aging, illness, sexuality, caregiving, dying, these are among the hardest things to talk about. And the quality of life that we have depends on our ability to have good communication about exactly these things. There are about 34 million caregivers in the US in any given year. So a lot of people are facing these struggles. And we all need to be able to talk to the people who love us about what kind of care we want while we're getting older, what kind of death do we want, what are our needs around intimacy. Those are things we need to be able to discuss. We need to discuss them with the people that we care about. And we also need to be able to discuss them with our doctors. And it would be nice if these were one-time conversations that you could just have and be done with, but they're not, because our desires about these things change over time. So we have to get good at not only opening the conversations, but at continuing to have them. So here's what I hope the book can do. Since these conversations are hard, sometimes beginning a hard conversation is easier if you have something to point to, something outside of your own situation, something that isn't personal to you. So if you can say, hey, Mom, I read this book and I'd love to talk about it with you, then the book raises the subject. The book raises the conversation. I also think that people who are in reading groups or book groups, when they read something, then start in that group context, learning how to talk about these things. They start sharing their own experiences. So they're talking about these things outside of the situation, the relationship where they need to have the conversation. They get practice, and they also get to hear other people do it. So they get to have alternative input, kind of new ways, new ideas, ways of thinking about these conversations. And I also hope that healthcare providers will read it, because it gives a pretty intimate view into one patient and one family's experience of the healthcare system. Healthcare providers are working in the system every day. They know its flaws. They know what's wrong with it, but they don't necessarily have the empathy that a particular person's experience shared like this in this intimate way can offer. So I'm hoping that they'll use the book to talk with each other about ways to improve the patient experience. It's a pretty tough system, the US healthcare system. So I'm hoping that if doctors read this, they'll be able to improve it a little bit.
So that segues into the next question, which is, your story highlights many of the challenges of navigating the US healthcare system. What allowed you to do it, and what advice do you have for other caregivers?
Wow, well, unlike the 34 million caregivers that I mentioned a minute ago, I had some incredible privilege and support as I was caring for my mother. The US healthcare system is not exactly the most humane in the world. For one thing, in the United States, we are guaranteed only 12 weeks of unpaid leave to take care of a child or ourselves or a sick family member. And that's without pay. I don't know a lot of people who can go 3 months without any pay. But I was able to do that. And I was able to do that partly because I had a job with a lot of security and a partner who had a career that paid well. And so we had money saved. I actually gave up a half a year's income to take care of my mom, and I don't regret a penny of it, but I was only able to do that because I had the financial stability that would allow it. I also had a really incredible support network. So my mother's sister, my aunt, and my mother's lover both did regular shifts with me at the hospital or at her home, helping to take care of her. So we were able to give each other a lot of respite. And my sister, who was in Georgia, participated by phone, and she also traveled from Georgia up to Philadelphia twice during the experience. So that provided me incredible respite also. In addition, I had a really close friend who gave me a place to stay when I was in Philadelphia after we had to give up my mother's apartment, and also lent me her car while I was there. These are things that most caregivers are not fortunate enough to have. So given that, one thing I think all caregivers can do is map out the resources that they have. So what friends or family members are going to be available to give you some respite, or to bring you a meal if you need one, or to just sit with the person you're taking care of for a night. Are there community resources in your area? In New York, there's a policy that allows certain Medicaid patients to train and select their own caregivers, and these can be family caregivers who can then get paid for caregiving. It's not nearly enough. It doesn't cover spouses, so a spouse can't benefit from that, but it's something. So finding out what resources are available in your community is also really important. It may not be financial. It may be that there's a Meals on Wheels program, or it may be that there's a senior center, something like that, that can be useful. So that's really important. And then the last thing that I think is, I say this to so many people, you have to remember the airline safety speech, right? If you've ever flown on an airplane, you know that they tell you when the cabin pressure can suddenly change, the masks are going to drop. Always put on your own mask before helping the child beside you, the person beside you. And so the message there is, you can't help somebody else unless you're taking care of yourself. That is incredibly hard to do when the person you're taking care of has these incredibly urgent needs, but you still have to do it. There's a research study I was reading recently that indicates that lots of caregivers deny their own health needs and their own financial needs while providing care. And that's partly because of the brutality of our social policy and our healthcare system. We really do need to do better. But to the degree that you can take care of yourself, that is such an important part of being a caregiver.
And now it's time for Tweet of the Week, where we select one of your tweets for you to tell us more about. You recently tweeted, "Caregiving for a partner requires self-care. Sometimes that means dating. Sometimes that's okay," with the hashtags relationships, aging, and healthcare. I think that's fascinating and something that's not often examined. Can you expand on that?
Sure. I tweeted that when I was sharing an article by Maria Del Russo in the Lily. I'm pretty sure the Lily is the Washington Post's gender newsletter, but I've been getting it for a while, and it often has these great links in it. Del Russo had talked to a number of women who were caregivers for partners. In many cases, they were partners with dementia, Alzheimer's-related kinds of things. And they felt like they could no longer meet their needs for intimacy in their relationships. One of the really sad things in this article was that so many of these women seemed to be doing the equivalent of cheating, and to keep their relationships secret. And even if their partners weren't really aware or able to be aware of what they were doing, there was clearly a sense of conflict about this. So in light of what we were talking about earlier, I think it's really important for partners to talk about what they want for themselves and what they want for each other in the event that they can't provide for one another's own needs for intimacy, or if they can't be sexual together. This wasn't something that was addressed in Del Russo's article, how to have these conversations, because that's not what she was exploring. But I do think it's really important for partners to talk about what kind of affection or intimacy or pleasure they might want, or they want for their partner, in the case that they can't communicate their desires, or they can't provide that kind of connection any longer. I mentioned Joan Price earlier. She wrote a blog post a few years ago about the importance of writing a sexual advance directive. And so this article made me think that that was something we should all consider.
Elizabeth's book is available on Amazon, and you can find the link in the description below the video, as well as a link to her website, elizabethannwood.com. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This was fun.